In February 1992, 3 graduates from the University of California in Los Angeles, Michael Morhaime, Frank Pierce, and Alan Adam, would form a company that concentrated on the porting of games like Rock 'n' Roll Racing, Lost Vikings, Shanghai 2, and RPM Racing to other systems. Originally named Silicon and Synapse, by 1993 Adam had decided that the name simply wasn't working. Reportedly because people were confusing the silicon in the name, derived from the chemical element used to make microchips, with silicon used in breast implants. They changed the name to Chaos Studios to reflect their development process, but by 1994, after being acquired by Davidson and Associates for a modern-day value of $13.3 million, they were contacted by a company based in Florida, Chaos Industries, who wanted them to pay $100,000, and they decided that the sum was just a little too rich for their blood, changing their name to Ogre Studios before being told by David and Associates that they didn't like that name, so they had to change it again. So Adam sat down and allegedly started looking through a dictionary, noting down literally any word that piqued his interest, according to Michael Morhaime. And the first word that cleared the legal check was interesting and was acceptable to Davidson and Associates, and that word was Blizzard, leading to their fourth and final name in May of 1994 becoming Blizzard Entertainment. Blizzard Entertainment, as a new and improved developer, began to look toward creating their own games, rather than just porting the work of other people, leading them to release the game that would put them on the map. Warcraft Orcs and Humans, a fantasy RTS game, a genre that they would quickly become highly acquainted with. Following Warcraft, they'd go on to make other hits and become a titan in the PC gaming space, with games like Diablo in 1997, an RPG dungeon looter that featured multiple classes, multiplayer, and item rarities, along with maps that are procedurally generated with themes. Following that, they debuted StarCraft, more of the same as Warcraft, but in space. But inevitably, it became just as insanely popular as the Warcraft franchise. And in 2004, they really kicked it up a notch. The game that broke them through the barrier of pop culture. The game that even fucking South Park had to take a jab at. They premiered World of Warcraft, which in and of itself would spawn even more spin-offs, to the point that I'm not sure how many players don't know that WoW started as an RTS game that looked like this. World of Warcraft took some of those RPG elements from Diablo, particularly having classes and dungeons, and turned them into an MMO, which in 2004 was still kind of niche for all but the most hardcore of PC gamers who'd likely prefer to deathmatch in Quake than kill a seemingly unkillable boss with people that they don't even know. But as games evolved, WoW proved that video games could be a legitimate bonding experience, with things like guilds and raids that required actual strategic planning, and they had this guy, and he was all over the internet for at least a few years before becoming an electrician. Arguably, WoW really popularized the idea of the online virtual economy, and it blurred the line between real tangible value and a collection of pixels that you would never in your life be able to actually grind for. And with WoW, you definitely would expect to grind and farm and grind until the carpal tunnel took over your hands. So for the next 10 to 12 years, Blizzard would rotate between those IPs, Warcraft, Diablo, and StarCraft, over and over before announcing in 2014 that they were working on a new intellectual property. Overwatch was riding the still relatively high popularity of Team Fortress 2, because honestly, name another hero shooter that could inspire an art style like this that was as popular as this. And if you said loadout, wrong answer, go straight to jail. It was a hero shooter that didn't feature TF2's range of cosmetic freedom, but rather skins and emotes with rarities and loot boxes you could earn freely for every level, no keys required. Its heroes has set standard kits, and if you wanted to change it up, you'd have to change the whole character. And at launch in May of 2016, there were 21 characters, and seeds were already being laid to tease characters like Doomfist and Sombra with a very notorious ARG, reckoning back to other online ARGs like Portal 2, and let's face it, ARGs are always fun. Overwatch was kind of an overnight success, something that Blizzard really wasn't a stranger to, and they would go on to foster an esports scene around the game, something Valve never did for their hero shooter, something that a whole documentary was even made about. But there was an earnest attempt in June of 2016, shortly after Overwatch launched, with the Meet Your Match update. But overall, for competitive, Overwatch won the round. This leaves us at modern day with Overwatch 2, having been released almost a year ago and the sequel to debatably the biggest game that Blizzard's ever made. But with Overwatch 2 having fallen from the high pedestal that it once stood on, and the company behind it falling equally from grace among the player base, the question stands: what does this guy think about Overwatch 2? I don't like it. Now, by now, you're probably familiar with the frequent comparison that people were making around Overwatch's release to Team Fortress 2, and it's not surprising to me. Both were highly stylized hero shooters, made by PC game giants, and even going back some length, both of those PC game giants were connected through the advent of Dota, and Valve hiring the dev team to make Dota 2 into a full-on game in the Source engine, later ported to Source 2. You see, Dota was initially a Warcraft 3 mod, and you don't care. 2016 really was a turbulent time. I mean, people were constantly making comparisons, matchups, SFMs, live action videos featuring characters from both games duking it out. The whole debate was honestly kind of dumb. And one thing that I heard a lot way back when was that they're two different games and they shouldn't be compared, which honestly, I mean, yeah, a game should be able to stand on its own merits, but I mean, comparing them is kind of fair, right? I mean, in recent memory, especially with major releases like Baldur's Gate 3 and Starfield, lots of games that have almost nothing in common are being compared, and in a situation like this, these are very different games. Almost downright idiotic to compare them. Being in the same genre doesn't necessarily mean that you can compare them, but this is a completely fair thing to compare. They have differences, but it's not like I'm pitting Spider-Man 2 against Baldur's Gate and calling it fair. With all of that being said, I'm not here today to compare them, but to provide my insight on why Overwatch 2, to me, is a very weak game. And I just so happen to be a long-time Team Fortress 2 player with 2,752 hours compared to the measly 96 in Overwatch? Really, 96? Is that all? Jesus. On top of all of that, as of the writing of this portion of the script, I only just played Overwatch 2 for the first time yesterday, so I figured I'd do my due diligence to ask the questions that nobody else wants to ask. The things that I want to set out to learn by making this video is what appeals people to Overwatch. Why do people so often want to compare it to Team Fortress 2, and some of them even try to claim that it's a better game? What factors about this game stands out to them that don't stand out to me? That's what I really want to know. And honestly, all of these videos that I make are a learning experience. I very, very rarely walk away with the exact same outlook I had going in when I do eventually walk back out. I see a lot of people always talking about Overwatch and how great it is, and then I see a lot more saying how bad it is. So I'm a little bit confused. In fact, if you go on Blizzard's forums, you'll find people complaining their little heads off about this game, and a lot of them have thousands of hours in this game, so it's a little bit weird. A little bit of the League of Legends effect if I had to pick some other game to compare it to. So, with all of that out of the way, my name's Cody, and maybe next year I'll finally get to cover the candy cane for Christmas, and I'm here to ask you one simple question and hopefully get one simple answer. How bad could it be? I first played Overwatch around launch in probably June or July of 2016. I mean, the long-rumored competitive matchmaking update for TF2 at the time, which became Meet Your Match, caught my interest. I've never been a Blizzard fan, and I mean, what's even going on here? Look at this. Can you decipher this?
Alright, thumbs up. Ready, guys? Let's do this. Leroy Jenkins!
This is a real image of someone's WoW HUD. You fucking psycho. And you know, I'm so accustomed to the idea of HUDs trying to remove as much clutter as possible that I forget MMOs literally sometimes go in the opposite direction. Around the time of Brigitte's announcement, I had my fill of Overwatch. It had become a game that I didn't hate, but its attention and constant media coverage, from lesbian kisses to fucking Blizzard World meta jokes, its annoyingly alive competitive scene to constantly changing the game in some of the worst ways possible, I just didn't want anything to do with it anymore. It was a game that, to me personally, was being catered to an audience that I clearly was not a part of. Thing is, I'm not particularly great at most multiplayer video games, and I'm fairly comfortable admitting that. My reaction time is poor, my aim is sloppy, and my nerves get the better of me, and that's why, for the most part, single-player games have always been my thing. Team Fortress 2 was the exception to that rule. Team Fortress 2, by nature, makes you enjoy it. Even when you do poorly, you're able to have fun, and that is a good thing. On top of this, every death is a learning experience because the visual language of the game translates what happened to you effectively. 9 characters, each using a certain playstyle and type of weapons. Rockets are soldiers, grenades are demo man, flames are pyro, and when visuals aren't enough, sound is, with the different hit scan weapons having different sounds to let you know what you're being attacked by. Overwatch, in contrast, has 39 heroes as of writing, with another coming frighteningly soon, and holy shit, I can't keep up. What do they do? So many sounds and visuals blend together when you play this game. Sometimes learning anything becomes this virtually impossible Herculean task to someone like me who has a hard time grasping aiming. This is a mess. Look at this. Who am I even fighting? The outlines don't help because so many of these characters just look the same. I'm getting ahead of myself. Overwatch wasn't for me, and that much was clear. The combination of the overstimulation and the catering to players who are less than skilled just didn't hit right. Overwatch, to me, also just took a lot of what TF2 did and tried to simplify it, and that just wasn't appealing. If I wanted to have a more casual Team Fortress 2 experience, I'd just play Man vs. Machine, or a trade server, or play Team Fortress 2 while critzing an NG or something. Torbjorn has no resource management, making proper turret placement a non-issue. Mercy can just follow airborne targets wherever she wants, and has the option to boost damage, filling the role of Medigun and Kritzkriegers in a way without the need of having to decide what fits the current battle situation. And Pharah can just hit a button to go airborne. The contrast to each of these characters to their best TF2 counterpart, Engineer's interesting design comes from the non-expendability of your buildings, with metal being limited. Medic is interesting to play because to be affected you have to know what medigun fits the best. It's the vaccinator, by the way, and using your crossbow when aiming becomes essential to aid your airborne teammates. Soldier gains a considerable advantage having the high ground, and has to rocket jump and damage himself to get to it. Overwatch removes any risk or skill that you would need in order to accomplish these things, and these guys have a certain barrier of entry and necessitate a certain level of practice to do well. To give the game the benefit of the doubt, I have heard the sentiment before in my personal life that this helps make the game accessible to people who maybe aren't great at FPS games, and that's fair. Accessibility and being able to play games however you want is the blood that runs through PC gaming after all, and I think that it's great. The problem is, this inhibits the game because everything is neutered to this degree of having little to no room to grow outside of aim and movement. There's nothing here to learn. No cloak management, no metal management, no rocket jumping, no counting Ubers, no counting health. Reinhardt's shield is probably the closest thing to any of those things that I could think of. And with all of that being said, that was Overwatch 1. back in 2016 to around the end of 2017, back before the game was on Steam. And to be clear, nothing worth noting happened between the time that I stopped playing and Overwatch 2's launch. Well, shit. In 2021, Blizzard was sued for some of the most horrendous sexual misconduct that I have ever seen. Even one of these sexual misconduct acts described alone would be enough for me or you to get fired from our jobs within minutes, seconds even. And Blizzard allowed this to be done for presumably years. While this lawsuit was settled in December 2023 as of the time of writing, I'm not entirely sure if that means that this is now out of the alleged category, but changing McCree's name because he was literally named one for one after one of the men who was named in the lawsuit who was supposedly guilty of sexual misconduct, that's pretty telling. One woman, Carrie Moynihan, even tragically took her own life during a business trip. There was a Cosby suite, apparently, whatever that means, and cube crawls involving alcohol and groping. What a fucking shit show. A disgusting fucking shit show. This video isn't meant to delve into the details of the lawsuit, but to mention it for relevance sake. Things like Tracer being lesbian, 76 being gay, Lifeweaver being pansexual, and Cassidy being a fitting allegory for being transgender, it all feels forced. And MadPat's quitting game theory, but I'll never let him live this TF2 isn't diverse crap down.
Overwatch, though, literally has a grandmother who snipes medicine into your body. That is equal opportunity, ladies and gentlemen.
I mean, knowing now that Blizzard behind closed doors was doing this shit, how could anyone possibly see that all of this diversity that they're still forcing into the game is a win in retrospect? This is the kind of thing you would really need to have a very compelling argument for me to be on board with anything you say after this kind of lawsuit. In many scenarios in entertainment, like Owl House, the Chucky or Child's Play series, particularly in the 90s and 2000s,
I'm not sure. Sometimes I feel like a boy. Sometimes I feel like a girl. Can I be both?
or Gravity Falls, creators really have to fight, have experience with, or allude to character sexuality, and that says a lot about the state of the world and the heavy censorship that studios tried to force upon creators. In Overwatch's case, they had the freedom to do it, and did, but the problem is, it was insincere. It was mainly just a bunch of frat boys sitting around making decisions to make their public image look better. Dana Terrace had to just throw it all at the wall to represent her characters the way she wanted them to, even knowing that the series would likely be cancelled, and when it was anyway, she just went fucking hog wild with it. Don Mancini, who helms the Chucky series himself, is gay, and has been ingrained in the LGBT community for decades. This has led him to being able to represent certain sections of those communities in the franchise, even if they were just illusions and metaphors, because the world at large really wasn't ready or able to comprehend it the way that he could, due to them being a bit more niche than the straight and unstraight status quo that they were used to.
It was a great opportunity to give young gay fans representation and to see themselves on screen in a way that I wasn't able to when I was 14 or 15 years old.
This is the case with Glenn and Glenda's gender fluidity being represented as dissociative identity disorder.
Glenn? Guess again, Daddy. Glenda? That's my name.
And Alex Hirsch, to avoid doing any of that, he had to just allude to the relationship between these goobers so that the censors wouldn't jump on him.
Probably just a dream.
With you, every day is a dream.
These guys, I'd argue that they earned what credit that they received in the communities for what they did, while Blizzard just did it and almost never brought it up again. Not to mention, half of this appeared in side content that never really had any impact on the game, and thus was inconsequential to the game's actual success. No risk, all reward. Let me be clear, representation in video games and other media is inherently a good thing. Not every LGBT character has to be Jake Wheeler or Luz Noceda, but if you're just going to make these characters gay, lesbian, and pan arbitrarily and then hardly never mention it again, why bother? At least from an outsider's perspective, we grow close to the characters that we watch, that we read about, and that we play as, because we can relate to them in some form or fashion to their struggles, even if we're not gay like them, white or black like them, or young like them, and showing those struggles helps solidify that representation as meaningful to the people that you want to represent, whether it be Jake Wheeler overcoming the adversity of not just being gay, but also losing the opportunity to have his father accept him for who he was due to a shocking loss, or Tiny Tina working to overcome the grief of losing someone close to her. You're telling the stories of the people who have gone through these things, and you owe it to make sure that they're represented and not just adding characters to represent them, because something is better than nothing, but then spitting in their face by never taking those aspects of their characters anywhere. Your players, if you intend to make them feel seen, deserve better than that. End of story. Initially, that's where this part of the script was going to end, but I do believe that I have a lot more to say. It's true that for a lot of people and groups, representation is something that not a lot of them have the luxury of having, and it's starting to be alleviated now, but back in 2016, that problem was really just starting to be even addressed. And I feel like naturally, a lot of people were just taking whatever they could get, because something is better than nothing, but when you get down to brass tacks about it, is it really? I mean, when you start taking whatever you can get and you're satisfied with the most surface level depiction of any LGBT representation at all, what you're doing is you're essentially telling them that you're satisfied and they can get away with giving you hardly anything. The bare minimum. It's just one kiss and a conversation, and that's all we're ever going to give you. I have always been of the belief that you don't need to be the same race, ethnicity, sex, or gender of a character in order to be able to identify or see yourself in them, but there's no denying that that kind of thing helps. It humanizes them and gives you something to relate to their struggles. Captain America doesn't need to be black to stand for the righteous ideals or help those who can't help themselves. But being black doesn't rob the mantle of what it means to be those things, and in a lot of ways, I'd say it even helps it, and Falcon and the Winter Soldier puts that on display perfectly. Just because you've had little to nothing doesn't mean that you deserve the bare minimum that a company is willing to put out in order to get you to consume the product. Sure, no company is ever going to be doing this kind of thing out of the goodness of their hearts because they like you. There's always going to be an ulterior motive, but creators like Dana Terrace at least ensure that we get to spend some time with those characters and care about them before they get thrown into the Disney vault and have the door locked behind them with the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse key. It's not sincere when companies do this kind of thing. It never is, and it certainly wasn't when Blizzard did it. But at the very least, those shows, those properties, they didn't introduce the relationship to quickly sweep it under the rug and forget that it ever happened. These companies, they owe it to you to represent you because they're making money off of you. And you shouldn't. You absolutely shouldn't just buy into the first thing you see because it has a rainbow flag on it and because you hardly ever see that kind of thing. You deserve better, and you need to stand up for better. Far too often do I see people just happy with whatever they can get because it's whatever they can get. But enough of what I have to say. Let's look at what some of these other guys that I spoke to have to say. True, to be honest. Knowing what was happening behind the doors paints the representation as nothing but a sheer crash grab. Team Fortress 2 may have been abandoned and ruined with bots, but that's still somehow better than the bastardization that happened to Overwatch. I definitely agree with Blizzard's somewhat pandering, especially now, but some of the rep Overwatch did was pretty monumental and not done really awfully, especially with Tracer and her lore. I definitely think you could say the identities for Overwatch were pretty tacked on and superficial, like with Pharah especially. Representation is arguably really hard in the gaming space, especially with most money being made overseas in China or the Middle East. It was quite daring adding Pride to Overwatch with the NYC Pride map and releasing banners. I don't know too much about the sexual harassment case, but I believe them to be true. I don't know how specific it would be to the Overwatch team, but I'd imagine the problems were company-wide. Like with Pharah especially. Representation is arguably really hard in the gaming space, especially with most money being made overseas in China or the Middle East. It was quite daring adding Pride to Overwatch with the NYC Pride map and releasing banners. I don't know too much about the sexual harassment case, but I believe them to be true. I don't know how specific it would be to the Overwatch team, but I'd imagine the problems were company-wide. I don't know the exact details of the Overwatch characters being LGBTQ+. However, that might just be a point to how pointless of a mention that kind of thing is. If you want to make a character diverse in some way, I very often don't like the "oh, by the way she's lesbian," and never mentioning it again. If Lara Croft was a lesbian and it was just said in some dev interview or something, I think that it would be fine, because the game is about playing as Lara Croft, and the interview does not impact that. For Overwatch 1 and 2 being a hero shooter trying very hard to give the characters they created a personality and make them feel at least a bit like a real person, an offside mention of someone's sexuality is very disappointing. In my opinion, you have to have it either be hidden but hinted at, like how Gwen Stacy is kinda sorta hinted at to be trans in the Spider-Verse movies, or it has to be overt. You don't have to make the bisexual character want to have sex with anyone, but maybe they're just a bit more flirty in general, though that could also be too close to the stereotype for some people's liking. You really can't have side traits for characters where the main focus is that you are playing as these characters. You aren't playing as generic World War II soldier 92310722903 in Call of Duty, you're playing as Tracer or Mercy, and you don't have to ship these characters. Most LGBT people aren't crazy upfront about them being LGBT. Maybe a flag in their bedroom or trinkets on the other side of the bed to hint that they maybe have a same-sex partner. It's really worse when you consider that Blizzard is Blizzard, and what was going on in the background, but I think definitely it's a case of diversity is cool, I promise, but then never following up on anything. I know for a fact that if there was an officially gay TF2 character, Valve would express it so much in the SFM shorts. Blizzard's tokenism in Overwatch in recent years feels to be a pretty tattered curtain pulled in front of their long history of making jokes out of race, gender, sexuality, and identity at large, both in their games and in their workplace behavior. It doesn't help that new tidbits only seem to be tossed out as an "oh, by the way" whenever they feel like they could use the reputation bump, nor does it help that there are details that are rarely, if ever, reflected in the heroes' characterizations or interactions, glossed over save for when they want to point and go, "see, we're inclusive," in a way that reeks of "oh, by the way, Dumbledore is gay." Characters not written as those identities, but often having them applied after the fact for PR points. Sure, not everybody is incredibly vocal about their identity, but for some people, those identities are quite important. I know I sure as hell's never shut up about being a lesbian. I definitely agree with a lot of points. While representation and diversity are great things to have, when it's insincere, it just makes a mockery of individuals like people in the LGBTQA community. There's a difference between, hey, here's a strong leading lesbian character and her girlfriend, their sexuality has a significant part in their life and story, we're going to show that, and, hey, Soldier 76 is gay, I guess, but we're really not going to elaborate any further on that. One is handled with care and intention, and the other with apathy and no thought. I'm definitely not saying people have to prove that their character is LGBTQA by shoving it in our face, as others might say, but there is some care that has to go into representing a character, especially a minority, and it just seems like the Overwatch team has not handled it with care. Quite the opposite with apathy and selfishness. It seemed like it was heading in the right direction with Overwatch 1 and Tracer's comic, but it sort of ended there. A great letdown for LGBTQA fans like myself and a lot of other people who loved Overwatch and rejoiced that representation. The Overwatch team could do better, but they choose not to. I don't know what exactly their intentions are with future LGBTQA characters, but it doesn't look bright. If you're going to make a trans character, make them trans. Show that. If you're going to make a character gay, show that representation. Overwatch's LGBT characters are absolutely forced. When the game came out, obviously everyone had headcanons for characters, just like every other piece of media. But Blizzard didn't actively start saying their characters were part of the LGBT community until after they started having a lot of this controversy even outside of Overwatch. But since Overwatch was their newest IP, it feels like they poured a lot of their attention into it since the fan base was relatively fresh. The first one I can think of is the Tracer pose controversy, where they changed an entire pose for her that the new community felt was overtly sexual, and the pandering just kept on from there. There was also some alluding to Soldier 76 and Reaper being gay early on, from what I remember, but none of the characters were confirmed to be LGBT until their public image started going down the drain. At least at the latest BlizzCon, they made the newest character, being non-binary, the most obvious part of the character. Like, representation matters, and having these characters just being some sort of LGBT out of nowhere is incredibly insincere towards the community that has struggled so hard to make their stories and themselves seen. Coming from someone who has struggled constantly with their identity and looked for representation in media just to feel comfortable with myself and seen, I can't justify looking at Overwatch and saying that it's good representation. What you wrote here hits the nail on the head. We don't deserve the bare minimum or being sold representation just to get us to consume their slop. If you're gonna make the character queer, then, do it with a little more than just saying it and shoving it under the rug. Being queer is something that affects almost every area of my life. It's not like it's all I think about or talk about, but it is integral to who I am, and you can always tell when that's portrayed insincerely. It reminds me of how people were clamoring for the first gay Disney princess when there's so much queer media outside of Disney. But because a company like Disney is so mainstream, getting that kind of rep from them would be huge. I can imagine Overwatch Blizzard fans feel similarly, and it's like being acknowledged by some kind of higher power. The thing is, these companies are only interested in making money, and being queer doesn't do that. They'll give us a kiss that they can cut out in international versions of the film, or a line of dialogue that you really have to hunt for, but they care more about their bottom line. The thing is, I have no doubt that there were probably queer artists working on this game who wanted to do their best, but the way that they would just market it as here's our new queer character, or this established character is queer now, and we're never gonna touch this again, is so disappointing. Obviously, a queer character isn't defined by queerness, but it's still a major influence on their lives and experiences. I'm sure there are queer Overwatch fans who feel seen by this, and that's okay, but I agree that we shouldn't be praising corporate entities for giving us table scraps. It's a multifaceted issue, and I think that there's a really solid mix of varying viewpoints here. Full disclosure, they don't know about this part, because I'm kind of just making it up while I'm talking. A lot of the people that I spoke to, Adam, Roz, Mikey, Lexi, all of them, I just asked them for their feedback on the section to make sure that I wasn't saying something that was out of pocket or out of hand or untrue, because it really mattered to me that someone who was more experienced with this kind of stuff saw what I was writing and gave their input. And I gotta say, it was kind of an eye-opening experience. In a lot of ways, it was very, very humbling to know that not only was I speaking some kind of truth, because a lot of what I said in this section they agreed with, but also that they gave me their stories, their thoughts, and their perspectives. Everything from Mikey's testimony that while it's not the only thing about him that is notable, being trans, that doesn't mean that it's something that you should just mention and forget. It is a part of who he is, and it does affect his everyday life. And Roz told me about how she struggled with her identity for a long, long time. I knew Roz before who she is now, and I can say she's a much happier person now than I think she ever was before. And she spoke a lot with me about Blizzard specifically, because she has a long history with Blizzard and MMOs in general, being a long-time World of Warcraft player. She spoke with me a lot about how Blizzard used to be so good at handling this kind of thing, representing people and expanding on their characters to take the most minute of their aspects and make them into bigger than themselves. But for whatever reason with Overwatch, they kind of fumbled the ball in favor of slapping on a label and then never ever talking about it again. Because that's what was making them money. Why would you put more time and effort than that into it if that's what was making you money? Just slapping the label on. In fact, a lot of Venture's coverage in the last BlizzCon, at least as I'm speaking, was focused on them being non-binary. Why was that the selling point and not the fact that they are a hero in Overwatch? It's completely secondary to the fact. But just knowing that people like Roz and Mikey and Nico exist, Blizzard should have spoken with more of them to find out their thoughts on these kinds of things before they just did them. They could have gone a lot farther with it than they did, and they chose the bare minimum, as always. To cap things off, Roz shared with me an image of a statue that stands outside of Blizzard headquarters. It's a statue of like a guy riding some kind of World of Warcraft horse mount thing, you know, the game that really put them on top, that made them an immovable giant of the PC industry. No matter what Blizzard does, people buy into it. And for a long time that statue stood, and it's got a plaque on it that says, "Every voice matters." And between their fumbling of LGBT representation in the proper way in a series that could really have used it, and their inability to properly address sexual misconduct allegations, or even properly manage the public outcry of, you know, people wanting Bobby Kotick to resign and things like that following that lawsuit, if there's one takeaway that I can take from all of that, it's that they certainly did not believe that every voice matters. There are loads of characters in this game, let alone the comics. And as of writing, there are currently 2 more known to be coming. Yes, they are currently out. That's how long it took to make this video. Totaling 40 fucking 1. And almost none of them have anything particularly interesting about them. I mean, this one here, they're non-binary. This one is a cowboy. This one is from space. It's all just stereotypes, and I've already talked about the tacking on of LGBT labels to characters, but let's be clear, this is a problem that also extends to stereotyping. And I want to reiterate on something that I truly do believe. The mercenaries are stereotypes, but at the same time, they're blank enough with little to no actual story to make them relatable. It helps to be able to immerse yourself in the class you play as, and having a favorite helps to be able to root for them no matter what the situation that they're in. Overwatch's characters, though, to me, while being stereotypes, they don't have enough depth to them to make it plausible that you'd be able to insert yourself into their shoes, and I don't necessarily mean by gameplay, but rather them as a character and immersing with them and, you know, being able to enjoy them. They have dialogue among themselves, they have history, they have clear wants and motivations. They are clearly coded as good or evil or sometimes a mix of both. And all of this makes you question why the good and bad guys are even fighting together on the same team to begin with. Blizzard simply missed the mark with me on this, and one minute they're underwriting and making characters gay to make up for the lack of interesting stories behind them, in the next they're creating the plot of The Last Starfighter. The reason I used to enjoy Overwatch more is that a lot of this world building wasn't present yet, and I was able to relate to a gamer and a mech. And then I find out that she's some kind of world-renowned professional gamer and fought in some kind of robot war after being drafted because Mecha, some South Korea-based organization, not the suit, had a hard time finding suitable candidates to pilot the suits, so they drafted professional gamers to do it. I mean, do you see what I mean? I mean, this guy, he builds a big gun and it shoots. That is so much easier for me to get behind, as somebody who likes to tinker with making things and doing minor programming work. And as such, I can see so much more in myself in this guy than I do in a dwarf with a story somehow more convoluted than d.va's, and it just all goes down from there. It gets increasingly more complicated with each character. So maybe I was wrong with the initial assumption that these characters have no depth. Maybe it's that they have too much depth. How do I possibly comprehend this for the starting roster of 21 characters at launch in 2016, let alone the 41 that we now have? 42. It's 42 now. It was 41, now it's 42. Just hear me out here. I don't know what the real problem is. I don't know if that they're underwritten or if they have too much depth. Either way, it's not worth it trying to wrap my head around all of this. When you're making something with characters, you have to understand that people will want to see themselves in those characters. Even if they're complicated or one-note stereotypes, you can make that work if you can find a middle ground. You can build a loyal fan base. You can have people who will partake in what you make for a long time. But when you overcomplicate them, give them so much lore and backstory and vague plot elements, your audience is going to have a hard time retaining all of that information and being able to see themselves in them or ground themselves, so to speak. Ghostbusters, for example, accomplishes this by providing an average Joe who doesn't know the specifics of the science behind what they make and do.
If there's a steady paycheck in it, I'll believe anything you say.
And later, the series evolves that same character into a rich finance man funding the operation. They build up characters to replace the average Joe they made and keep the whole thing feeling grounded. The characters you make, they can have an impact on people's lives.
But one day, I saw this show about this hero. He was unstoppable. No matter how many times he was beat up or blown up or electrocuted,
No matter how many planes he crashed or how much property damage he caused.
he always got back up and fought for what's right. Then maybe I can be on the lunchbox that inspires some other kid like me.
When you make them overly complicated, set in some fantastical sci-fi world where hardly anything is recognizable to a real-world analog, it makes it hard to enjoy the medium because it's not grounded. It doesn't have to be realistic, but making it too far gone from reality can only hinder what you make. The TF2 mercenaries may have access to teleporters and cloaking tech, but they also use regular guns, wear normal clothes, mostly normal clothes, I should say. They're just guys. But when you're faced with a character who travels through time and carries a rechargeable bomb with guns that auto-reload with some kind of voodoo, how am I supposed to relate to this character? Making her lesbian does not make up for all of those fantastical elements. Almost nothing about this character stands out to me. Personally, anyway. And that's not to say that Blizzard can't do it. One of the big reasons World of Warcraft has retained its popularity, and even gained that popularity in the first place, is that its world and lore building, they feel organic. And being an MMO helps to immerse yourself because you're playing in the world that they built. Overwatch, though, is just a mess of maps, vaguely connected by common recurring brands and faces, with very little connectivity or world to immerse yourself in. It's a first-person shooter, so you visit on a map-by-map basis, but no matter how many times those maps change with small details, it's hard to immerse yourself in a world this complex in a first-person shooter. Moving on to the meat and potatoes, Overwatch's gameplay, for lack of a better term, is frustrating. Each of its gameplay elements on an individual level, I can usually see the meaning behind them. The distinct color outlines to indicate team affiliation, health bars to see your progress toward defeating an enemy, ultimates to use after doing well. I mean, I get all of that. Overwatch was touted as more of a MOBA shooter at launch than your traditional hero shooter, at least by the media, and a lot of those things are present in MOBAs as well. My issue is that it all clashes together. Take a peek at this. I mean, can you make heads or tails of what any of this is? If you can, you're either smarter than me or wasted enough time to be able to decipher that this foreign language Blizzard has made. And does every single thing need to be color-coded? And here's a fun fact. I don't have any particular clip in mind when I'm saying all this. I feel this way about every match I play in this game. But it wasn't always that way. I used to enjoy the game for what it was, but a phenomenon that I feel all games have been undergoing is a lack of clear visual language. You may have seen this with games like Halo or the Half-Life remake Black Mesa, games that were not designed in a way to have this much visual fidelity. Overwatch released in 2016, and I know it's not quite that old. Overwatch suffers from an oversaturation of not just effects, but characters. And coming back to this game after even a few month hiatus leaves you with a feeling of, how does any of this work? Just quickly using Team Fortress 2 as a comparison, this game hardly ever has to use this outline and glowy shit. Very, very rarely, and only really does it for objectives. They don't need to color code bullets to show you what team they're coming from. They don't need to outline the characters to tell you what team they're on. They don't need to do any of that, because the game was designed in such a way to visually give you all of that information without having to oversaturate it with outlines and colors. But my issue with gameplay isn't only in the visual language that the game is trying to feed to me, it's also in a lot of the asinine decisions that they make. While writing the script, they gave all of the characters the ability to heal 20 health a second after 5 seconds of not taking damage. And that, to me, is fucking criminal. Can you imagine for a second what Team Fortress 2 would be like if any of these characters, besides the one who should be able to passively heal, could passively heal at such an obscene rate? The wiki's wording is a little bit vague, so I'm trying my best here. As a medic, you can only get close to that 20 HP a second that Overwatch gives to all of its characters regardless of role if you're healing an injured teammate. And that's a feat that should very rarely be possible if you're doing your damn job as a medic. And at your top health, you can only get 12 a second if you're healing an injured teammate and haven't taken any damage for 10 seconds. That's all you get for all of that trouble. 12 HP a second. All of those are factors that very, very rarely meet in the middle if you're playing a class like the medic who has a target the size of Germany on his fucking back. And for all of that trouble, what's Overwatch's requirements for being able to earn 20 HP a second? Stay out of combat for 5 seconds. That's it. It's maddening, honestly, if you want my own personal opinion, I guess. This is one of the things that Overwatch has always suffered from, the simplification of the gameplay. If you play Overwatch for 20 or 30 hours, chances are you'll find your favorites and practically master everything that they're capable of, and Overwatch wears this on their shoulder too. Blizzard touted their lack of an ammo count on release. No more worrying about having to find an ammo pack. Torbjorn and any kind of resource needed for his buildings? As if. Blizzard seems content taking gameplay elements that have always proven to be the barrier between a player with good management skills and a player who's got a trigger finger that's just a bit too itchy. And for me, I feel like these changes really just take any tension out of a fight. It's one thing to aim, a thing that appears also has been considerably made easier, but it's another to have the ammo to finish the fight. Sure, you still have to reload, but not having to worry about reserves has always made me feel like there's no point in making every shot count. This isn't considering just how many types of health bars that I have to keep track of. There are 4 types of health that you have to deal with. Base health, shields, armor, overhealth, and if you're up against a character like Reinhardt, you might even have a 5th type of health bar to overcome in the form of his shield. Like his physical shield, not his health bar shield. It's confusing. Do you see why it's confusing? And not every character has all types, but there's enough types here to drive me fucking insane. Especially since some decrease damage taken, except for some exceptions, and just looking over the Wikipedia, half of this means nothing to me. Certain roles take less damage overall, and have more or less of certain types, or start to heal more quickly, and while all of this is far from impossible to understand, it's too much for me to keep track of. Blizzard somehow managed to neuter the shit out of many competitive online FPS staples, and still make it one of the biggest competitive games in the entire world. The point that I'm making is that I could go into depth about each of these things, but then we'd be here literally all day. And while you watching at home likely don't need it, we still have another game to compare it to. Team Fortress 2 in comparison is a very different beast. There's no shield, no armor, no barrier health, you have one health pool. That's it. And the thing is, I don't mind resistances or buffs or nerfs depending on class, but in a game like Team Fortress 2, which has very few examples of that with most attributes like that applying to one specific character and not the role, it'd be very understandable considering there's only 9 characters to have to keep track of. It's simple. It's not overly complicated, but it has a plethora of options and depth. Still, keeping track of it all is nowhere near the ever-growing incomprehensible cavalcade of characters, abilities, health bars, and health pools. Overwatch's biggest crime, ultimately, is that it's confusing. Look at this mess. There's glows, explosions, and particles everywhere. Voice lines indicate certain skills are being used, causing audible pollution. If you could hear my reaction in the footage and ask any of the people that were playing with me, my reaction is literally almost 100% of the time me uttering the phrase, "What the hell is going on?" There's too much. Despite the attempt to make sure that even a child could understand what's happening most of the time, it just makes people like me, who are easily overwhelmed, not understand what's happening at all most of the time, because half the time I die, I have no fucking idea what I died to. So just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, look at this. Look at this. Frame 1, frame 2. Frame 1, frame 2. Frame 1, frame 2. What hit me? What in this image hit me that took 190 health in a frame? Because all of these outlines everywhere, they make everything so terrible. I very much hate when no matter how much time I put in, I don't know who shot what or what's happening. There's also balancing, and we'll talk more about that later, but how do you balance this many characters? Some characters simply don't seem to die. Some have McCree or Soldier's ultimate and can wipe a whole battlefield before you can even determine what's happening. And some have D.Va's, an ultimate that is very easy to waste due to being able to hide behind a sheet of paper to avoid it. Roadhog is a tank that can not only heal himself, but also gain damage resistance doing it. Torbjorn's turret has an effectively infinite range almost, auto-aim, and can be thrown down and built with little to no investment from any Torbjorn outside of a few seconds of his time. These characters vary wildly, and usually only a handful of them are any good at any point, and in a roster this bloody big, that's a terrible thing to have. If 2/3 of your catalog is practically useless, and some characters like Mercy are given obvious preferential treatment, why keep making new characters? At what point do you admit that this is too much? That your variety is actively harming the game's learning curve? Then, most of these characters now you have to work to unlock before ever even knowing how they would play in an actual real match. I unlocked Junker Queen. I spent time unlocking Junker Queen. Who run Barter Town? I run Barter Town! But she's fucking terrible. She requires the use of this wounding mechanic that's supposed to heal you to give you your tank status, but sometimes it doesn't seem like it works. I love unlocking characters with unique, confusing mechanics that make no fucking sense and are hit or miss if it works. Some characters have skills that sometimes insta-kill and sometimes don't, it feels like. This game's balance has always been a point of contention, and it feels like instead of tweaking the rules of the game, they prefer to add more on top of it. Does every character need a health regen? Was that really the answer? In reviewing footage, I realized why this game confuses me so much. With things like this, or this, how am I supposed to glean or learn from the mistake that I made if my only mistake was seemingly playing the fucking game? This clip here shows Sombra blipping out of existence when I'm 100% confident that she should have died, and while each of these situations have been explained to me in full, it was only after I could edit and started asking for input from people who know far more than me about this game, who also admit that almost all of it is due to Overwatch's horseshit balancing. This game frequently leaves me feeling more and more confused with loads of questions that it obviously never intends to attempt to answer. Overwatch simply isn't a balanced game. It's packed full of situations, kits, and characters that, for someone like me, it's hard to know what the hell is even happening at any given point. And I know that I keep harping on about it, but truly, this game makes no sense most times. Look at this clip that I showed in the intro. I chose this to illustrate Overwatch's big issues of overstimulation during gameplay. Voice lines, music, particle effects, trails following bullets. Comparing to Team Fortress 2, it's a relatively plain game. Bullets have some very light effects, but they're not glowing at all times because they don't need to be. Being hit scanned, it doesn't really matter if I can see it fly through the air or not. It's more important that I can determine what is shooting at me. If you're engrossed in Team Fortress 2's culture, I guess, you've probably heard this before, but Team Fortress 2's characters have traits unique to them. Their outlines, postures, animations show you exactly what you're fighting, and you can immediately determine what their threat level is comparative to your skill level and class. Overwatch, in contrast, has so many slender feminine characters or masculine characters with a big gun with such minimal differences that from farther away, especially on the darker maps, it's hard to immediately tell who they are with all of this other shit on the screen to contend with. Lights, glowing trails, it clutters my eyes. And the voice lines, music, and sound effects, they clutter my ears. Reviewing all of this footage has led me to one revelation. In theory, this game is designed well, but the problem with theory is that theory in practice is better in theory than in practice. And in practice, playing it feels like a fever dream that I'll never be able to decipher before I ultimately succumb to Soldier 76 staring at me the wrong way, and I have to respawn. Playing the game is also often a chore, because the whole role queue system makes you opt in for a role or let the game decide for you before you ever see what you're going to go up against. And if your team is doing poorly, the most that you can do is swap within your role. That's it. The new system punishes you for wanting to play what you want to play by making you have to wait longer for what you want to play, typically that being tank or DPS, but that's due to most everyone wanting to play those roles. Supports do find games faster, and if you want to get into a game the fastest, doing an open queue is your best bet, and pretty frequently you usually end up playing support anyway. All of that was done due to people ending up in roles that they didn't want to be, apparently. And I mean, the easiest way to do that would have been to not have a report system that is fundamentally flawed and utilized to punish people for playing the game how they want and not submitting to the peer pressure of playing a specific hero on a certain map with a certain strategy to fit with a certain meta. That still happens, by the way. One big point of contention that I have consistently had was the report system, and Blizzard's refusal to allow for you to act like, a person. Things as minute as swearing get you banned. A collegiate esports player, Mason Quain, who goes by Durpee, was banned and had his college career ended in April 2024 because he said a naughty word. Not only did he get banned, he didn't really receive a reason until reaching out to customer support on Twitter, and was then only told that it was due to using fuck and shit in a game. Eventually, this led to a permaban in June of 2024 because he typed the words WTF. Blizzard's response when they were approached about the issue and the fact that there's a profanity filter to block swearing was a very confusing no. The filter is for those who wish to use it, but profanity has never been allowed in our games. If reported, is absolutely actionable. from PJ. Fuck you, PJ. PJ also goes on to send the Blizzard's in-game code of conduct, citing the very first section under communication, and reading the whole thing as written: when participating in communication of any kind, chat, voice communication, group finder, you are responsible for how you express yourself. You may not use language that could be offensive or vulgar to others. Hate speech and discriminatory language is inappropriate, as is any obscene or disruptive language. Threatening or harassing another player is always unacceptable, regardless of language used. Violating any of these expectations will result in account restrictions. More serious and repeated violations will result in greater restrictions. Listen, I could play semantics all day, but this highlights a greater point of legalese in that this section is still substantially vague. You may not use language that could be offensive or vulgar to others, is the only section of this that could actually support such a point, but it's so shallow, and that's usually the point. Typically, statements like these are left that vague with no examples so that they can point to them when they make a decision like this one, and they can use it as supporting evidence. On top of that, the mythical PJ mentions that actions like this, if reported, absolutely actionable. This made me and many others ask the question, if swearing never has been allowed and you clearly have a profanity filter that works and filters profanity, that must mean the client has a way to detect a swear was said. So why not use that to take action on the spot rather than only acting if reported? Or why not change McCree's belt, which has an initialism containing a swear word on it as well? 2 of them, even. This has been a problem for a long time. Loosey-goosey ban rules that mean nothing until they conveniently fit the exact thing you're being accused of. And if enough people report you, you get hammered for it whether you're doing those things or not, and need to jump through a set of hoops to get unbanned and somehow prove that you're innocent. You see, their report system really relies off of automation, so if you get reported enough times, you're just going to receive an automatic ban whether you did anything or not, simply based on you got reported this many times. The thing is, I get the need to be able to enforce moderation on swearing to a degree. It is entirely possible to be verbally abusive to someone without being bigoted or telling them to off themselves. But the big issue here is that the report system appears to be automated, and it's very hard to get a reply from a real fucking person sometimes with these newer customer service systems. But to then double down on such a small, insignificant infraction instead of saying, oops, it got mass reported by people you were probably better than and got auto-banned, is a little bit ridiculous. Automated systems only work if there's some human influence in the process, but popular consensus is that enough reports against the same person results in a ban being handed out regardless of the facts. It's a broken system that's easily abusable by stacked teams of like-minded freaks, and a system that needs to be corrected. Anything beyond that, I'd be repeating myself. And perhaps you could find a very good reason why these kinds of systems are almost entirely automated, but agree to disagree, I suppose. And Blizzard, if you're watching, fix this mess and get a real person involved. Please. I'm not against content updates. They can really give your game some fresh air. And a lot of games that I've been enjoying have content updates coming, and I'm looking forward to them. But before you do something like adding entirely new characters with new skills and mechanics to your first-person shooter, you need to finish trying to balance the ones you have first. Remember earlier when I aggressively mentioned people pushing others to only pick certain characters? A lot of that stems from the fact that so often in this game's life cycle, some characters are simply much better than others in their field, and some still are. Farah and Mercy, for instance, can still dominate a battlefield with relative ease by just being in the air and having the Mercy follow her up to heal and boost damage as appropriate. And with the occasional Zarya in the mix, it becomes a real pain in the ass. Bastion and Reinhardt was once nearly unbeatable before a significant change to Bastion with Overwatch 2's release, and maybe a few nerfs before then. And that list keeps going on. It wouldn't grind my gears so much if maybe for once they actually attempted to properly balance many of these things without having entire new game releases, nuking a whole character into oblivion, changing player counts, or making broad blanket changes to roles. To do all of that and still constantly release new characters like Venture and Juno at a pace of around 3 new characters a year, reminding you again that the first game launched with 21 characters, we are nearly at double that number with still major glaring balance issues. Most recently, they tried to offset the need for certain healing-focused supports by adding the ability for all heroes to have some level of passive healing. But this is just one of those aforementioned blanket changes that they made seemingly only to make it easier and more enjoyable to play the game, rather than actually fixing any of the issues that make the game a horrible experience to begin with. I didn't intend initially for this video to be this long. I mean, how bad could it have been to just write a video about Overwatch 2's gameplay and why I dislike it? But the more I go into it, the more I delve back into the game and try to find some semblance of sense as someone who did not keep up with this game's development at all, it's confusing. Reviewing back only a few of my big gripes, it has way too much visual and audible stimulation to keep track of. Too many characters to keep track of. Most of those characters aren't worth playing anyway. You have no ability to actually try these characters in a real game with real people until you do a bunch of shit with a different character in a similar role, thus basically wasting your time. The report system is nonsensical and operates almost automatically, and a handful of people could easily get you banned or suspended with little to no actual infraction being done, and they're constantly adding things despite most of what's here is either too powerful or not powerful enough. That list goes on, and these kinds of things add up. And to be clear, those are only aspects that affect the gameplay and not the things surrounding it. I'm sure that for many of Overwatch's diehard fans out there, these issues are trivial. They're small bridges to cross. You can always learn about a game, you can memorize damage numbers and character kits, and some people are willing to put in that kind of effort. But in my eyes, knowing a company like Blizzard is willing to let these egregious amounts of sexual harassment go unpunished, to the point of a woman committing suicide, using representation as marketing tactics, banning players for something so small as 1 or 2 swear words, and to top it all off, not even having the fucking courtesy to make their shit game enjoyable to people who haven't sunk the last 8 years of their life into learning every trick, meta, and strategy under the sun, it makes me mad. I know this is coming from Valve's biggest fan, and I understand that it seemed like my view is skewed, and as a reminder, I have played over 100 hours of this game, over 20 just to get the footage for this video. Valve isn't the best company in the world either, but even if it takes a while, Valve at the very least always appears to try to get around to doing the right thing for the customer who engage with their products. Recently, they've waived force arbitration clauses, they've fixed a 4-year-old bot problem, and they made Linux a more accessible gaming option almost entirely out of their pocket. These are the kinds of things that make me admire and hold a company like Valve close to my heart. And if the worst thing I can say is that it took you longer than I wanted, but it still got done, well, that's good enough in my book. With all of that being said, my name's Cody, I hate Overwatch 2, and I'll see you next time.